The lights were blinding, and I could feel the sweat dripping down my back. I was on stage, and the whole world seemed to be watching. The music was loud, and my heart was pounding. I was performing, but I felt like I was being attacked. The audience was divided. Some were screaming for more, and others were looking at me like I was the devil himself. I remember that night clearly. It was December 1956, and the New York Times had just published an article about me. They quoted Reverend Charles Howard Graff, who called me a revolt from the tried and true. He said I was using innuendo and suggestion by curl of lip and shake of hip. I didn't know what to think. Was I really that bad? The criticism didn't stop there. In the UK, a magazine called Picturegoer wrote an article that made me feel even worse. They said that the idea of me coming to England filled them with advance revulsion. They thought I was dangerous and didn't want to see British kids carving my name on their arms with knives. It was like they were afraid of me. But I didn't feel like a dangerous man. I was just a guy from Memphis who loved music and wanted to share it with the world. I remember thinking, how can giving people music be bad? But that's what some people thought. Then there were the defenders. Jock Carroll wrote in Weekend magazine that the old folks who criticized me were being silly. He said, ever hear of Marilyn Monroe, Anita Ekberg, Jane Russell, Zsa Zsa Gabor, Eartha Kitt, or perhaps in your day Mae West or Theda Bara? What do you think the girls have been selling? Violin lessons. He had a point. I wasn't the first to be criticized for being sexy. John S. Wilson wrote in the New York Times that I was tuned to my times, just like Frank Sinatra and Benny Goodman were tuned to theirs. That made me feel a little better. But the criticism was still there, and it was affecting my performances. On July 1st, 1956, I appeared on the Steve Allen Show. They wanted to do something different, so they had me wear a tuxedo and sing Hound Dog to a basset hound. It was supposed to be funny, but it felt weird. I was a rock and roll singer, not a comedian. I remember feeling uncomfortable, but I went along with it. Steve Allen later wrote that it was a joke on Middle America, not on me. He said they were willing to accept me as long as I looked respectable, but it didn't feel that way at the time. The next day, I went to the studio to record Hound Dog. I had been singing it on stage for weeks, but in the studio it was different. I went through 31 takes before I was satisfied. It was a song that was full of energy and determination. I felt like I was fighting back against all the criticism. The critics in the UK didn't like it. They said I was defying them to decipher some of the words, but the rhythm was enough to make a teddy boy uproot a cinema seat. Then we recorded Don't Be Cruel. It was a completely different song. It was smooth and easy, and I felt like I was inviting people to fall in love with me. It showed that I could do more than just rock and roll. I could be soft and gentle too. I felt like I was growing as an artist, but the critics were still there. They were watching every move I made, and I knew I had to keep pushing forward. I couldn't let them stop me. I was just a guy from Memphis, but I was determined to change the world with my music. I remember when I first stepped into the radio recorder's studio in Hollywood. It was early September 1956, and I felt the pressure. I was already a star, but I needed to deliver more. My team and I were there to record a new single and an entire album. The Jordanaires were with me, and they added a richness to my sound that I hadn't experienced before. Their voices blended perfectly with mine, giving my songs a fuller, richer feel. The first song we recorded was Playing for Keeps. It was written by Stan Kessler, who had written some of my earlier hits. The Jordanaires' backing vocals were perfect, sometimes supporting me, sometimes adding their own flair. I sang it with a mix of tenderness and determination, and it felt like my ballad singing was finally catching up to my rock and roll stuff. Next, we tackled Love Me. Jerry Leiber and Mike Stoller, who had written Hound Dog, gave me this song. I slowed it down and stripped it back to the basics. It became an aching plea for love, and my voice was exposed, raw, and honest. Mike Stoller said it was genuinely touching, and I think he was right. How's the World Treating You was another ballad, written by Chet Atkins and Boudleaux Bryant. It was a country standard, and I made it my own. The arrangement was stark, which let every nuance of my voice shine through. Even my critics couldn't deny that I sang every word clearly and with feeling. We tried a more upbeat song called How Do You Think I Feel? It took 7 takes to get it right, but the finished product was just passable. It was a bit rhythmically awkward, and I could see that I was getting a bit bored. The pressure was on, and I wanted to move on. The next day, we recorded When My Blue Moon Turns to Gold Again. It was a cross between my Sun recordings and the lighter shuffle of Don't Be Cruel. I sang the verses I knew, but the song lacked structure and a real climax. It was pleasant, but didn't go anywhere. I also recorded Long Tall Sally, but it didn't have the same energy as my live performances. The arrangement was too clean and polite, and it felt like a pale imitation of the real thing. But things picked up with Ready Teddy. I was fully engaged, and it had a rock and roll feel that would become more prominent in my later work. I felt alive, and the song rocked with abandon. It was a good sign that I could still bring the energy when I needed to. Rip It Up was the last song we recorded. I was fully committed, but it could have been even better if I had sung it in a higher key. The live version had more intensity, but this studio version was still solid. I also recorded Old Shep, a song I had been performing since I was 10. It was a tearjerker, and I dug deep into my emotions. The Jordanaires' backing vocals were beautiful, and the song was over 4 minutes long, which was unusual for me at the time. It was a great performance, and it showed that I could handle ballads with depth and feeling. Paralyzed came next, and it had a similar shuffle rhythm to Don't Be Cruel. It was pleasant, but it felt a bit second-hand. Then we recorded Too Much, which was a blues song but a bit heavy-handed. The pace was slow, and it got monotonous after a while. Scotty Moore's guitar solo was praised, but it lacked coherence at times. In a Place Is Paradise was one of the best songs we recorded. It had a sparser arrangement, and I got to show off my blues vocals. Bill Black's bass work was terrific, and Gordon Stoker's piano breaks added a lot to the song. It was a great track, even if it was only released as an album cut. On the final night, we recorded First in Line, a ballad that I co-wrote with Ben Weissman. It was a lovely song, but the echo was too much, making it hard to appreciate. Ben would go on to write many more songs for me, some great and some not so much. When we finished, we had enough material for a new single and an album. Too Much and Playing for Keeps were released as a single in January 1957. The album, simply titled Elvis, used the rest of the tracks from these sessions. It wasn't as uneven as my first album, but it also didn't capture the excitement of my live shows. Still, it was a solid record, and it showed how I sounded in the second half of 1956. I remember when I got to be a national sensation, and it was a wild ride. In January 1957, a guy named John S. Wilson wrote in the New York Times that he really liked some of the songs on my new album. He said So Glad You're Mine was a great country blues song, and In a Place Is Paradise was a strong blues tune. He also noticed that I was getting better at singing and presenting myself, which made him think I had a bright future ahead. Billboard magazine was pretty excited too. They said my new album was going to be a big hit, and that people were already placing lots of orders for it. They talked about how I could really bring the house down with songs like Rip It Up and When My Blue Moon Turns to Gold Again. It was clear that my fans were going to love it. One of the biggest moments of 1956 was when I appeared on Toast of the Town, hosted by Ed Sullivan. The show was a big deal, and everyone was talking about it. I had to be careful, because some people thought my performances were too wild. But when I was on the show, I tried to keep things in check. I sang Love Me Tender, and it was a reminder that I could do more than just rock and roll. The first time I was on the show, I was a little nervous, but I didn't show it. I sang Hound Dog and Don't Be Cruel, and the audience went wild. Some critics said I was more restrained, but one guy, Jack Good, was still not a fan. He wrote that I was still a problem for people's ears, but at least I wasn't as wild as before. For my second appearance, I was more relaxed. I even laughed a little when the audience reacted to Don't Be Cruel. I sang Love Me Tender again, but this time I changed some of the lyrics. I also sang Ready Teddy instead of Love Me. It was a good show, and I was promoting the songs from my new album. The third time I was on the show, I sang 7 songs, and they were mostly shorter versions of my hits. I also performed Too Much, which was better than the studio version, and When My Blue Moon Turns to Gold Again, which was more lively. The highlight was when I sang Peace in the Valley, a gospel song. Ed Sullivan even came on stage and said I was a fine, decent boy. That was a big moment for me because it showed that I was starting to be accepted by more people. In September, I went back to Tupelo, Mississippi, where I had performed when I was just a kid. I gave 2 shows and the crowd was crazy. I could barely hear myself sing over the screams. I only sang songs that I had already recorded, and I tried to keep the audience calm. It was a wild scene, and the local newspaper said the crowd was trying to tear pieces of my clothes as souvenirs. Later that year, I did a jam session at Sun Studios with Jerry Lee Lewis, Carl Perkins, and Johnny Cash. We sang a bunch of songs, and it was a lot of fun. We did some gospel songs, and I even sang Reconsider Baby, which I would record later. It was a special moment, and the tapes of the session have become legendary. Some people think the music isn't great, but it's a piece of history. In December, I did my last show of the year at the Louisiana Hayride in Shreveport. I didn't get paid for it, but the money went to a good cause. The show was a good bye to the place where I had started, and I gave it my all. The next day, the newspaper talked more about how I looked and moved than about my singing, but it was clear that I had a big impact on the audience. At the end of the year, the attacks on me in the press were getting more intense. Some people were trying to figure out why I was so popular with teenagers. A psychiatrist said it was because I looked like an adult but acted like a kid, which made it easy for teenagers to relate to me. Even in the UK, people were talking about me, and some thought I had a voice that could make Caruso spin in his grave. I was starting to get tired of the questions about whether I was causing kids to be delinquent. I responded by asking if delinquency had really increased since I became famous, or if it had been a problem for a long time. It was clear that I was more than just a passing fad, and I was here to stay. In 1957, I was on top of the world. The year before had been a whirlwind. I hit the charts, made my way to Hollywood, and appeared on TV. But with all the success came a lot of criticism. People were writing awful things about me, and it really hurt. I kept every article, and some of them made me feel so bad I could hardly sleep. I couldn't help but let it get to me. One of the things that bothered me the most was when ministers spoke out against me. I'm a deeply religious person, and it felt like a personal attack. They also criticized the kids who loved my music, calling them delinquents. I couldn't understand why people were so scared of teenagers expressing themselves. Some reporters even made up stories, saying I ate 10 hamburgers or 8 eggs for breakfast, which wasn't true. They also said I was criticized for buying Cadillacs, but if I had the money, why shouldn't I spend it? And about Colonel Parker, my manager, they said he was taking advantage of me, but we both made money and it was a good partnership. Despite all the negativity, there were some who saw through the hype. One article titled Elvis Presley, Is It Sex or Talent?, suggested that I wasn't just a passing fad. The writer thought I would be a big name in show business for a long time, just like Frank Sinatra and Johnny Ray. That gave me some hope. 1957 started off well with a great performance on Ed Sullivan's Show, where he called me thoroughly all right, but the attacks didn't stop. Newspapers, gossip magazines, and tabloids were all writing sensational stories about me. One article even suggested that my fans were part of a cult, and another claimed I learned my dance moves from strippers. It was all so ridiculous. Fans started fighting back, and some of their responses were pretty intense. One critic even received a letter that threatened her with horsewhipping and being thrown to the lions. It was crazy, but it showed how much people cared. Not everyone was against me, though. Some columnists like Fred Sparks and George E. Sokolsky wrote positive things. Fred said the people criticizing me were the real problem, and George said I could outlast the critics with my singing. Even my manager, Tom Parker, spoke up, saying I was a symbol for young people who felt unheard. In January, I got to record some gospel songs, which I had been hoping to do for a while. I Believe was the first song we recorded, but it had some mistakes. Peace in the Valley was much better, and it felt like I had grown into the song after performing it live. Take My Hand, Precious Lord was the highlight. It was a powerful, emotional performance that really showed what I was capable of as a singer. I poured my heart into it, and it felt like I was bearing my soul after a tough year. We also recorded some upbeat songs, but not all of them worked out. I Beg of You was one we had to put aside and come back to later. It didn't quite feel right the first time around. Despite everything, 1957 was a year of growth for me. I was on top of the world, but I was also facing a lot of challenges. The attacks kept coming, but I knew I had the support of my fans and some people who believed in me. It was a roller coaster, but I was determined to keep going. I was back in the studio, working on songs for my second movie, Loving You. The first song we tackled was Mean Woman Blues. This one was pure rock and roll, with a classic 12-bar blues progression. I remember feeling the energy from the band and the thrill of the music. The song just flowed, and the band's instrumental breaks were amazing. It felt like we were all in sync. Then we moved on to Got a Lot of Livin' to Do. At first, it seemed promising, with a driving intro that reminded me a bit of Jerry Lee Lewis. But something went wrong. I started using those hiccuping sounds and sputtering my way through the choruses. It was like I was trying too hard, and it didn't sound natural. Critics had been complaining about my diction, and maybe I was overcompensating. The lyrics became hard to understand, and it just didn't feel right. We did a couple more versions for the movie, but they didn't fix the issue. Next, we recorded All Shook Up. This song was a hit from the start. It was smooth and radio-friendly, with a catchy melody that everyone could recognize. I didn't have to do much to make it work. It just felt right. The song was a natural fit for me, and it showed how much I had grown as a performer. Even though some critics thought I had gone from sensational to just terrific, the song was still a surefire hit. A few days later, I was on the Paramount soundstage, recording more songs for Loving You. The conditions weren't great, but we made it work. We started with Let's Have a Party. It was a fun, energetic song about, well, having a party. I gave it my all, but it was too short at just 90 seconds. Despite that, it did well in the UK and even reached the top of the charts. We also recorded Hot Dog, another short but sweet track. It had a mix of my harder rock and roll sound, and some of the styles from my Sun Records days. It was a shame it was so short, but it had a great feeling. Lonesome Cowboy was a bit different. It had a dramatic opening, and then turned into a Western-themed song. The arrangement was full and rich, and you could hear the clip-clopping sound that reminded me of Blue Moon from my Sun days. It was a ballad, and you could really hear the power in my voice. I was starting to love the dramatic and theatrical side of music. Teddy Bear became one of my biggest hits, but it didn't age well. The lyrics were a bit silly, and I used those vocal mannerisms a lot. It's a song I performed in concerts later, but I never really felt connected to it. Still, it was a hit, and that's what mattered. We recorded different versions of Loving You for the movie, and one of the best was the farm version. It was simple and charming, with a harmonica and a plaintive feel. It worked better than the beefier version we ended up using as a B-side. I also tried One Night, but the lyrics were too risque. We had to change them to make the song more acceptable. When we did the remake, it was a different story. The song was a scorching blues belter, and it felt like a jam session. The band and I were on fire, and it was one of those moments where everything just clicked. We also recorded Don't Leave Me Now, a ballad that took a lot of takes to get right. It wasn't groundbreaking, but it was a solid addition to the album. I Beg of You was a struggle. We tried to make it work, but it just didn't have the spark. It was a bit fussy, and even my best efforts couldn't bring it to life. Despite the mixed results, the movie Loving You gave people a chance to see me in color for the first time. The reviews were mixed, but some critics saw improvement in my acting. I was more natural, and the movie was a hit at the box office. It wasn't a critic's darling, but it didn't matter. People loved it, and that's what counted. We did a few more sessions, recording songs like It Is No Secret What God Can Do, Is It So Strange, and Have I Told You Lately That I Love You. Some were good, some were okay, but it was clear that the magic wasn't always there. Still, we kept pushing, and that's what it's all about, keeping the music alive and reaching out to the fans. Will Friedwald, a music critic, says that deep down Elvis was a crooner. He believed Elvis came from the same musical background as great singers like Bing Crosby, Al Jolson, Billy Eckstine, Dean Martin, and even Frank Sinatra. Elvis showed this in his early recordings at Sun Studios in 1953 and talked about his love for classic songs to a magazine. One of the best examples of Elvis's crooning was his cover of True Love from the movie High Society. He sang every word perfectly, showing how much he understood and appreciated this kind of music. It's a Cole Porter song, and while some of Porter's songs can be complex, this one was simple and worked great with a subtle arrangement and the warm backing of the Jordanaires. However, not all of Elvis's ballads were as impressive. His version of I Need You So by Ivory Joe Hunter was pretty typical. The arrangement was similar to another ballad he recorded, Don't Leave Me Now, and while Elvis's voice was passionate, it didn't stand out much from other ballads he sang around that time. When it came to recording the single version of Loving You, things were a bit more mixed. The song was from his second movie, but it ended up as the B-side with Teddy Bear on the A-side. The song itself wasn't one of Leiber and Stoller's best, but Elvis's gentle and sincere voice made it better than it could have been. The session also included a song called When It Rains, It Really Pours. Elvis tried to make it work, but it still sounded unfinished and a bit messy. It wasn't released until 1965, and even then, it was probably just because they needed more material for an album. In early 1957, Elvis's recordings were hit or miss. Some were amazing, like One Night, but others, like Blueberry Hill, were not so great. His voice was getting better, but he was struggling to come up with consistently good songs. After a few sessions, he only went back to the studio twice that year, but he regained his confidence and produced some great music. The Loving You album came out in July 1957, and was the weakest so far. The first side had songs from the movie, but some were very short. The second side had a mix of ballads, but not all were well-known or even ballads. It was a typical Elvis album, put together quickly with random songs. Some tracks, like Blueberry Hill, probably should have stayed in the vault. Despite the mixed quality, the album sold well because fans were hungry for new Elvis music. But it showed that Elvis's albums were often just a collection of whatever tracks they had, rather than a carefully planned project. In early 1957, Elvis was still a big topic in the news. His manager, Tom Parker, was getting a lot of attention for how he handled Elvis's career. Parker talked about how he turned Elvis's talent into $1 million success. He sold all kinds of Elvis merchandise, from lipsticks to t-shirts, and defended Elvis as a normal 21-year-old. Not all the press was positive, though. Some articles reported that Elvis's popularity was fading. One story even said that a group of college students burned Elvis records at a charity auction. But fans quickly wrote to newspapers to defend him, and some papers admitted that Elvis was still very popular. Elvis was back on stage, and the reactions were the same as before. Fans still went wild, and there were even reports of fans storming the stage and causing injuries. In Canada, his concerts drew large crowds and required a big police presence. In April and May, Elvis recorded songs for his next movie, Jailhouse Rock. The songs were better than those from his previous movies, and Elvis was back in top form. The opening of Jailhouse Rock is one of the most famous in rock and roll. The song is energetic and full of fun lyrics. It became one of Elvis's most iconic recordings, and a highlight in his movie career. On the other end of the spectrum, Young and Beautiful showed Elvis's softer side. It's a beautiful ballad with a simple piano arrangement. The song transitions smoothly into a jazz club feel, and Elvis's vocals are really touching. He even tried it out in a rehearsal in 1972, but it never made it into his regular concert set. I Want to Be Free is another ballad where Elvis used his vocal tricks, breaking words up in a way that worked well. There's also a version of the song from the movie where he sings it more straightforwardly. Elvis re-recorded Don't Leave Me Now, but it's hard to see why. The earlier version was released on the Loving You album, and this later version was on the Jailhouse Rock EP. It's a bit confusing, but both versions are good. Baby I Don't Care was a fun, energetic song with a strong bass line played by Elvis himself. His vocals were bubbly and infectious, and it's a great example of how Leiber and Stoller could make rock and roll songs that were both sophisticated and catchy. These sessions marked a return to form for Elvis, and the songs from Jailhouse Rock were some of his best work. Elvis and I had a complex relationship with the critics and the public. Back in 1957, while Jailhouse Rock was my best movie so far, not everyone was a fan. Some reviewers were starting to see me in a better light, but others were still harsh. The New York Times said my singing was actually understandable this time, but they still had a lot to say about the same old things. Harrison's reports, though, thought I was getting better as an actor, even if my character wasn't very nice. The UK, the Times had mixed feelings. They admitted my music had some melody, even if it was a bit wild. But Donald Zeck from the Daily Mirror absolutely hated the movie. He called it a disgusting, violent mess, and said the flogging scene was just there to shock people. The Guardian wondered if the movie was made that way on purpose, to match how my fans liked their rock and roll. Then there were the really wild stories. Some people were writing about me in tabloids, linking me to sex, violence, and even the devil. One magazine, True Strange, had an article with illustrations showing my concerts as if they were scenes from Dante's Inferno. They talked about Elvis Presley sex clubs, and a girl who shot her brother because he made fun of my singing. I don't think any of that was true, but it made for good drama. A reverend named Candy Ricin, Hoover, wrote in Rave magazine that what I was doing was wrong and inspired by the devil. He said I was spreading sex and blasphemy, and he warned people to pray before it was too late. He even tried to make my name look bad by saying it was an anagram of devil and evils. It was all pretty wild, but not everyone believed it. Johnny Ray, another singer, said the charges against me were unfair and bigoted. I was hurt by all the criticism, but I didn't let it stop me. In September 1957, I went to the studio to record a Christmas album. I wasn't too excited about it, but I also recorded 2 other songs by Leiber and Stoller, Treat Me Nice and Don't. Treat Me Nice was a hit from the movie, but I thought I could do better. The new version was smoother and more relaxed, but it didn't feel like a big step forward. Don't, on the other hand, was a beautiful ballad that showed how much I had grown as a singer. I also recorded My Wish Came True, which had a tricky melody, but I really loved it. I tried a lot of takes, but it never quite felt right. For the Christmas songs, Blue Christmas became a favorite. I recorded it with the Jordanaires and Millie Kirkham, and it had a great bluesy feel. Here Comes Santa Claus was more traditional, but still had some neat rhythm changes. The carols Silent Night and O Little Town of Bethlehem were both beautiful, especially O Little Town of Bethlehem, which had a more complex melody. I'll Be Home for Christmas was another standout, with a rich, emotional vocal. Santa Bring My Baby Back to Me was softer and more playful, and Santa Claus is Back in Town was a hard blues song with some naughty lyrics. The most controversial song was White Christmas. I recorded it in a style similar to the Drifters, and it was so different that Irving Berlin, who wrote the song, apparently freaked out and tried to get radio stations to stop playing it. Despite all the criticism and weird stories, I kept making music. I knew what I was doing and I believed in my art. By the end of 1957, I was at a crossroads. My Christmas album, which had caused a stir with both praise and criticism, was just one of the many things that year that showed how much I had grown. Some people, like Irving Berlin, might have had issues with my version of White Christmas, but the truth is, no one really knows if that story is even true. Despite the rumors, the album has stood the test of time and is now considered a classic. It's got a mix of reverence and a touch of my own style, especially in the song Santa Claus is Back in Town, which is as raucous and playful as you can get. I also faced some backlash from radio stations that banned my Christmas songs, thinking they were too different or even disrespectful. But the music itself is what really matters, and it's clear that it resonated with many people. Even though the album wasn't an instant hit, it's now one of the most beloved Christmas records out there. In the latter part of 1957, I did a couple of tours both in the US and Canada. The shows were intense, and the reactions were mixed. Some people loved the energy, while others thought it was too much. In Vancouver, a critic called it an unhealthy exploitation, but back in Portland, I was praised for my hard work and the songs that made me famous. It was a wild ride, and the police in Los Angeles even told me to clean it up and tone it down, which I did my best to follow. My last performances of the year were in Hawaii, and it was a unique experience. I spent more time at the piano than with my guitar, and the shows were memorable, but the drama didn't stop there. A woman was even taken to the hospital after her husband stabbed her because of a joke about me. It was a crazy time, and it showed how much my presence could affect people. In early 1958, I started work on my next film, King Creole. This was a big step for me, not just as an actor but as a musician. The director, Michael Curtiz, was a legend, and he helped me reach new heights. The film's soundtrack was a challenge because it mixed rock and roll with New Orleans jazz. It was a new sound for me, but I embraced it. Songs like Hard-Headed Woman, Trouble, and Dixieland Rock showed how well I could adapt to different styles. Even the ballads like Don't Ask Me Why and As Long As I Have You had a maturity to them that I hadn't shown before. The title song, King Creole, was a standout. It was a song that needed a strong performance, and I gave it everything I had. The horns and the band were amazing, but it was my voice that really made the song stand out. It was a journey, and I learned a lot during those sessions. Looking back, 1957 and early 1958 were pivotal years for me. I faced criticism, but I also grew as an artist. The music, the shows, and the films were all part of a bigger story, and they helped shape who I became. The road wasn't always easy, but it was always worth it.